How's it going, everyone? It is your boy Adrian from Pink Pirates TCG, and we are back with another video. So with Treasure Cup coming up very soon and running all throughout the month of February, I've been getting a lot of videos kind of talking about this is what I am running and the deck list, the cards I'm running, and this is why I think you should play them. This is the guide on how to play them. But I haven't seen a lot of the flip side of that. So I wanted to kind of talk about how to beat the meta pretty much. So I'm going to make a series of videos coming out this week and all throughout the month of February talking about the different decks, their strengths and weaknesses, as well as going over an example deck list for you guys so you know exactly what threats are present. It's going to be really useful for you guys that only play one or two decks, so you might have not seen a full deck list for this. So let's get right into it. Today's video is going to be about Zoro and Luffy. So let's quickly go over these two leader skills. They kind of work in a similar way in that they just want to use and extend their Dawn and generate value through their resources as opposed to something like card advantage. So for Luffy, it's extending that one extra Dawn by attaching a rested Dawn to another character or your leader. This is going to open up combos that you didn't have before, and it's going to let you swing for bigger numbers overall. While Zoro is going to multiply that Dawn, since when you put a Dawn under him, he's going to extend that plus 1000 attack over to every character that is available to attack in the turn. So he's going to be the more common deck you're going to see out of the two because he really accentuates that go wide and go very aggressive kind of playstyle that Red wants to encapsulate. But they're essentially going to work in almost the exact same way. Zoro's just going to be way better at pushing that aggression and going wider with the board, while Luffy can choose to be more passive and maybe attack with one or two characters at a time. But as long as you are swinging for those numbers and getting that damage in, you're going to be able to kind of hold more cards in your hand to close out the game, whereas Zoro will just run out of steam way quicker. So let's get right into the strengths of this deck that you're going to want to look out for. Starting off with its main selling point, this deck has so many fast and aggressive options to play, like Rush Zoro and Sanji, as well as just the ability to make huge boards and swing with a lot of attackers, since, you know, everything in the deck is such a low cost, and that's going to force either life or cards out of your hand, which you have to be very cautious of with your resource management. They also just have this unique utility in things like Jet Pistol that you have to play around so they don't put you behind during your turns, as well as things like Uta to get their resources back. These decks are also just very Dawn efficient, right? Like what we were talking about, since they are able to extend their Dawn past that usual 10, they can do this through their leader skills as well as cards with like Brook. And of course, since they have cards like Nami, and also have really cheap threats in general, they're just going to be hyper consistent, right? So not only do they have the Searcher, but because a lot of their deck is just low cost characters, they're almost always going to have something to play. So to beat this deck, you really have to understand these strengths and just try to stop them or mitigate them from happening, especially with things like Jet Pistol. You could play around it, play around things like Trigger Jet Pistol, which is awful since Jet Pistol has the trigger, play this card. You want to make sure that you are swinging with all of your characters first at life when you're doing that, and then you want to play your threats because you don't want to be the sucker that like plays Basil Hawkins and then attacks life, and then you get trigger Jet Pistol, you just lose that Basil Hawkins for free, right? Also look out for Red Hawk when, you know, they have 2 Dawn up. Do not lose your blockers, and just make sure you're using your cards efficiently to counter and block damage when needed. You don't want to be using more than 2 cards to block with this deck. There's going to be a lot of opportunities to block with 1 card, which is where you're going to have most of your decision making be done, right? But with that being said, you know, this is a lot of strengths, but let's look at their glaring weaknesses that you're going to want to exploit when facing this deck. So the first glaring weakness you're going to want to kind of take advantage of is because this deck doesn't have a lot of card advantage and draw, it's going to run out of steam way faster than the other decks. Most of Red's cards just do something on play maybe, or have rush, or have some when attacking effect. They attack and then they get dealt with, right? It even runs like vanilla cards. So a lot of the time what ends up happening is you're going to get into this cycle where they will attack you, you either counter or maybe you take life, you deal with their board, rinse and repeat, and they're going to run out of cards very quickly doing this, allowing you to control their hand in the late game. This also goes into the next point that I wanted to talk about, is just because a lot of the deck is just low cost and low attack characters, it's very difficult to take control of the board in the mid to late game against pretty much every deck, right? And every deck is going to have some sort of non-committal way to get rid of your threats outside of, just attacking into them. So in the mirror, they could use their own KO effects since so many of their cards are low attack. Blue could bounce their board, green can rest and attack into their characters. They can even just straight up KO their rested characters with things like Killer and X-Drake. And purple can just straight up KO things with their on-play effects, making it just incredibly difficult to take board control in the mid to late game when you need to. So what's going to end up happening is, you're going to run out of steam in terms of card draw, but also in terms of board state, because they're just going to deal with every threat that's on your board, and it's going to be tough to kind of continue that pressure into the late game unless you have some sort of end game plays like Shanks. So another huge glaring weakness I see is because this deck is so focused on attacking and there aren't a lot of good defensive options for this deck, it's very bad at staving off aggression themselves on the opponent's crackback turns. So a lot of the times, like, you'll find that decks have, defensive options like blockers, these crazy event cards that get them a lot of value, but red doesn't have anything like that. So, if you can't kill your opponent fast enough, they're just going to outvalue you, out-utility you, and just win the game because you aren't going to be able to defend yourself since you're using all of your cards to attack and get your opponent to 0 life. And then on top of all of this, it's actually really easy to play around red's threats. Since their plays are so limited, you can properly plan for these threats that red has, like, rush Luffy, especially when they have a very small hand. There's only like a number of plays that they can do. So let's just look at what those threats are in a example deck list so we can be ready for those potential things coming out and being used against us. In my opinion, this is probably what the most standard Zoro list is going to look like. And as you can see, there's a lot of low-cost characters like Vivi, Sanji, and Brook, and then with some characters being, middle of the road or high cost like 5-cost Luffy and Shanks to transition into your endgame. And what you really want to be wary of is those endgame threats like Luffy and Shanks, as well as the Zoro, right? Because these cards have Rush. They can just immediately come out swinging from your opponent's hand, and if you're not properly ready for them, they might just ruin your game and kind of be the reason why you lost in the first place, right? Because for every other card that red has, it's on the board, you could account for it, but what kind of slips your mind is these rush cards that they can use to take the board. And that's one of the main ways that red can take the board, is with these rush cards, so that you get into this cycle where you're just playing catch up with them, right? So you don't want to be wasting cards on characters most of the time, unless maybe you're playing a deck like Doflamingo where you need those characters on board. But for the most part, like, I usually just let them go through and then attack into their characters. If they're wasting time attacking one of your characters and not attacking your face, that's a very good thing. And most of all, just make sure you are super wary of the endgame threats like Shanks and Luffy, as well as Diombo Jambe, just things that are going to bypass a lot of your blockers in the late game. Especially if you have to choose between, should I put out a blocker or should I leave 2 Dawn up for a counter. I've been in so many situations where I have to choose between the two, and most of the time it's going to be more beneficial to try to counter out with the event, right? Because if they are dropping this 5-cost Luffy and attaching 5 Dawn to it, you better be ready to counter an 11k attack if you're at 0 life. And the same goes with Shanks. If you can make sure that you have higher attack blockers like 5-cost Law, Queen, so that they just don't get to bypass your blockers and win the game, that's really great for you, because they lose so much of their endgame threats by wasting attacks, and then on the crackback turn you just deal with it, right? And then just always be mindful of how you're countering with this deck. You want to make sure that you aren't countering with more than 2 cards unless you're in a really bad spot, because in the endgame you are going to want those cards in your hand you might not be able to block these high attack cards that are ignoring these blockers, and it's just useful to have resources in the endgame where red is the weakest, right? So that's going to be the end of this video, guys. I just want it to be, you know, short, simple, and sweet so that it's easy for you guys to kind of consume this information and just get in general tips for it. But what do you guys do for this red matchup? Feel free to use the comment section as sort of a forum, you know, for let's get those matchup specific knowledges in there so it's just all easy in one place to understand. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know how we're doing. And the next video is going to be about Green Kid, so look out for that one. That's going to be coming out very, very soon. And we're eventually going to get through basically every deck until Treasure Cup ends. So I'll see you guys later. See you on the next one.